Part 5. According to the rules of love in our most popular fairy tales, when two young people, for instance Cinderella and her prince, marry for the sake of love, they always live happily ever after. But perhaps a more apt description of what happens when two young people marry for the sake of love is found within that chapter of science known as geology. As anyone who has taken an introductory geology class learns, conditions along the boundaries of the Earth's tectonic plates in the lithosphere can vary. Along some plate boundaries, a lot of bumping and grinding occurs as one plate slowly but gently slides against another, coming close but never really merging. In other boundaries, a growing divide can develop as the two plates slowly drift apart. But when two plates strongly collide, more dramatic conditions develop. Either they smash each other to bits along the edges, building up literally a mountain range of rubble, or, if the densities of the plates are too dissimilar, the edge of the denser plate is shoved beneath the other, forcing it deep into the earth where the melting of rock occurs. This area of fiery submersion, known as a subduction zone, best describes where I now found my newlywed self to be. Shortly upon our return to Chapel Hill from our honeymoon and holiday visits, the ground beneath my feet suddenly felt as if it were tilting, flinging me down a steep rocky incline into a place of darkness and frightening self-dissolution. My primary conception of self, namely that I was a good person walking the good path of learning how to love, began to dissolve, and I saw a new, more disturbing image of myself emerge. Had I always been so controlling, so critical, and so caustic? The rate at which I sank into this dark new persona could be measured by how often, within the first few months of our marriage, I left our marital bed in the middle of the night to sleep on the sofa in the living room. There I would sometimes lie awake for hours at a time, pondering my predicament. Though we had decided to live in my apartment rather than Paul's, my living room no longer felt like home to me. For the sake of practicality, we had replaced my furniture with Paul's. His sofa, unlike my family's old couch, housed within its belly a mattress that could be used in a pinch for guests. His end tables, coffee table, and bookcase provided us with much-needed storage space. And his bed, unlike my old twin-sized bed, was built for two. But as functional as Paul's furniture was, I missed my family's old couch, my favorite reading chair, the small wooden bookcase that had housed my most treasured books, my desk, an old desk of my father's which I had refinished, and even my family's old card table, which had served as my dining room table until Paul's laminate-topped replacement arrived. The absence of all my familiar pieces of furniture, all of which had been returned to my parents' house, weighed heavily upon me. Now when I looked around my living room at all the fake wood pieces of Paul's furniture, I felt surrounded by ugly invaders. But another contribution to the quickening rate at which I sank into my own personal fiery subduction zone was that Paul and I could not agree upon what qualified as clean. I preferred vacuumed floors and dust-free furniture and a sparkling bathroom, none of which were easy to accomplish when piles of dirty socks constantly carpeted the floor, math papers, books, and journals remained stacked on tables and chairs, Trimmed mustache hairs continued to litter the bathroom sink, and the toilet rim revealed, most especially when the seat was left up, that Paul did not always have a perfect aim. Yet another factor which hastened my slide into the fiery pit of despair was that I no longer had any space to call my own. Paul could still claim his corner of the math office that he shared with a few of his fellow graduate students, but I had nothing but a quiet sidewalk whenever I found the time for a solitary walk in the surrounding neighborhood where we lived. And though I very much enjoyed these walks, upon my return to our apartment, the fog of Paul's chaotic clutter would seep like a vapor into the pores of my skin, and I would be transformed into a sort of fairy tale troll. The only difference between me and the troll beneath the bridge in the story The Three Billy Goats Gruff is that I never threatened to gobble Paul up. I only nagged and slung insults his way. Paul, I soon discovered, did not respond to my insults or criticisms in the manner of my younger siblings, who had always quickly countered my angry belittlements of them with equally disparaging remarks about me. The reign of sibling insults in my family never lasted for more than a few minutes. Like a summer thunderstorm that soon passes, leaving the air clear and full of sunshine, the arguments with my siblings swept away any of the tensions that occasionally cropped up between us. Such arguments were, I believed, part of belonging to a family, which is why I didn't understand when Paul withdrew from me each time I expressed my anger. Did he not know how to argue? One time, Paul proudly presented to me a story he had written for a high school English class. The piece had received high praise from his teacher, and I was honored that he wanted to share it with me. But as I read the essay, I felt a surge of rising irritation. Finally, I could no longer contain it. "This writing isn't real," I said. "How can you write about being a soldier in Vietnam when you've never been a soldier and you've never been to Vietnam?" Paul snatched the pages of his story from my hands and refused to speak to me about the matter ever again. In yet another lost opportunity for enhanced communication, Paul refused to argue with me one day after I insulted a poem he loved. Earlier, he had stated that all educated people should have at least a few of the poetry classics memorized. To demonstrate his own state of exalted education, he solemnly intoned, "Tiger, tiger, burning bright, in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry?" "I hate that line," I said, interrupting him so I wouldn't have to listen to Blake's overly sappy display of sentimentality for an animal I was sure he had never seen outside his imagination. "Symmetry doesn't rhyme with I said. "Aren't you bothered by that?" Paul's quick flash of anger in his eyes showed me that I was the only thing bothering him in the moment. Yet again he refused to play against me in that old game of family argumentation. All I got was the silent treatment. What was wrong with him? Didn't he know that people who love each other are always going to argue every now and then? Little did I know then that when Paul was a boy, his older, naturally athletic brother had often launched insults his way, but Paul, unlike my younger siblings, had never been allowed to return the favor without a well-launched fist connecting to his body. Perhaps my insults and criticisms triggered for Paul a childhood form of defense, shrinking further into himself in order to be less of a target. Or he might have been following the example set by his mother, who, when angry, had always withdrawn to her room and waited for the offending family member, usually Paul's father, to knock on her door and apologize. If Paul wanted an apology from me, he never got it. I may not have liked the troll I had become, but I still blamed him for my submersion into the subduction zone where my transformation into a troll had begun. From the stories Paul told, the only female other than myself who had ever criticized him was his first grade elementary school teacher. She hated boys, he told me, as if that could be the only explanation. Even Paul's mother had once asked, "Did he ever tell you about his first grade teacher?" Shaking her head from side to side, as if the thought of a teacher being displeased with her youngest son were inconceivable, she added, "That teacher hated boys." I wasn't so sure. First grade Paul might not have been a perfect angel. After the trauma of first grade, Paul had tried extra hard to excel at school. Year after year, through the remaining time of his scholastic career, every teacher but one had gifted him with some version of a gold star for exceeding their expectations. In his freshman year of college, a professor had, according to Paul, unfairly bestowed upon him the letter grade of B in a political science class. Paul's parents, most especially his mother, glowed whenever they spoke about him. He was, in their eyes, an accomplished young man, but I was beginning to think of him as a goody two-shoes who lived to be praised and who crumbled when the praise wasn't forthcoming. Still, though, on a goodness scale of 1 to 10, even I knew he had me beat. Though I suspected that if he had been grading himself privately, he would have given himself a 10, I would have given him an 8. That's the grade I would have given myself before I was married. But since my dip into trolldom, I felt more like a 5. Unlike me, Paul hardly ever used bad language or had ever been drunk. He never insulted others, never went above the speed limit, and his grades, except for that 1 year of elementary school and that one political science class in college, had always been perfect. So perfect that his path through college and graduate school had been paved with impressive scholarships. This is why his parents had indeed, as I had initially suspected, purchased his car for him. And I agreed with their actions. He deserved to be rewarded. But why couldn't I also receive a little credit for my attempts to be good? Paul may not have known about the inner voice that had shaped so much of my young life or the individuals in my recent past whom I had helped while acting as a secret friend. But he certainly did know that I had stopped wearing all my beloved 14-karat gold pierced earrings, most of which had been gifts from my parents, the day after he told me he didn't like pierced ears. I had also quit drinking beer and wine, since he still considered alcohol to be evil. And one day I had even gone to the trouble and embarrassment of purchasing a sexy black negligee, to which he had responded, "It's not you. Take it off." It seemed that none of my gestures of generosity ever changed the status of our relationship, and so my eruptions of angry troll insults continued. One day we were in my mother's Volvo station wagon, which we had borrowed in order to return the last of my furniture to their home in western North Carolina. Paul, who was at the wheel, and who was not used to driving along winding mountainous roads, took a curve a little too fast and caused the tires of my mother's car to squeal. I relished the thought that for the first time ever I had caught Paul speeding, even if unintentionally so. "God damn," I said. "Slow down, Paul. For heaven's sake, this is my mother's car." Without any warning, Paul veered off the road and skidded to a halt in the gravel parking area of a scenic overlook. Amidst a cloud of swirling gravel dust, he pointed a finger towards me and sternly admonished, "Stop your cursing. That is not the way a lady speaks." "You asshole," countered my inner troll. "I'll curse as much as I want. Quit expecting me to be like your mother. I'm not your mother, goddammit." I was pleased by the shades of fury that filled his face, but that was as far as his expression of anger progressed. We remained in silence for the rest of our journey, and in the midst of that silence, I eventually remembered something. I was supposed to be learning how to love this guy. Why in the hell did it seem that I was moving in the opposite direction? In whatever past life we had shared, I decided, we must have been the greatest of enemies. Though our faces may have looked increasingly strained with each passing day of our marriage, the frequent pattern of sex set into place before we were married continued. It was as if once the lights were turned out, our brains turned off as well. Everything in the bedroom remained the same except for this. No longer did I lie against Paul after the sex was over, feeling what I had always assumed was the loving connection between our souls. Instead, I would lie in bed listening to him snore, angry that he was keeping me awake, or on those nights when I felt the wave of panic rising inside my chest, I would take my pillow out to the sofa to sleep. My dreams, most especially on those nights when I was able to fall asleep in the bed beside Paul, were fitful. In some of my dreams, I would see him across a busy four-lane street in a city, and though I called and waved to him from my side of the street, he never saw or heard me. In another recurring dream, I would be alone in the room of a large house, calling to Paul to rescue me from the dark thing in the corner of the room. But in these particular dreams, a large fist seemed to be squeezing my throat, causing my voice to be nothing more than a croak. And what was at that point the latest in a string of recurring dreams, I would see Paul passionately kissing another woman. Though I couldn't see her clearly enough to know what she looked like, I always knew it was the same woman. And whenever I awoke from this dream, I shot up like an arrow, my mind whirling in a murderous rage, glaring at Paul until he woke up. "What's wrong?" he would grumble when, after 60 seconds or so, he awoke. "I had that dream again. I saw you with that same woman. Are you having an affair?" "You're crazy," he always would mumble as he shifted to his side so that his back was to me. "I'm not having an affair. Go back to sleep and leave me alone." On those nights, I would lie awake, either beside him in the bed or back out on the sofa in the living room, rehashing the dream, trying to analyze it. Why was it always the same woman? Who in the hell was she? What did she represent? One night it was Paul who awoke in a state of agitation. "I had a dream," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You were gone. You had left me." And though I wrapped my arms around him to comfort him, I felt a little guilty, for I still longed for my freedom. Only for the sake of what I believed were the lessons of my soul, learning how to love a former enemy, did I remain. My resolve, however, was weakening. In fact, it seemed that with each passing day we grew further and further apart. Convinced that what we needed was more common interest and activities, I convinced Paul to sign up for a campus bowling class with me. But to my great shock, during the class he had pointedly ignored me while actively flirting with three sweet and attractive science major co-eds, though they politely giggled at every one of Paul's frequent attempts to be witty. I noticed a look of confusion in their eyes whenever they glanced my way. I was confused too. What in the hell was he doing? After the bowling class, when I asked Paul to explain to me what was going on, he said, "I don't know what you're talking about." "I'm talking about the way you acted with those girls, as if you were an unmarried guy on the prowl." "I was only being friendly," he said. "Am I no longer allowed to be friendly?" Week after week, the bowling class served only to separate us further, since Paul's friendly behavior towards his female fan club continued, and since, as a consequence of his behavior, I left him to go partner with a group of sweet science geeks at the opposite end of the bowling alley. Sometimes I caught the eyes of my intelligent bowling buddies lingering upon my glistening diamond engagement ring and wedding band. Each time I wanted to say, "Yeah, I'm married," to a jerk at the other end of the bowling alley. At the end of every bowling class, one of us would linger at the door waiting for the other, so we could at least make our exit together. In silence, we trekked across the parking lot, Paul usually 5 feet ahead of me, back to his Toyota Celica. This was the same lot where, as we were walking back to his parked car months before, he had abruptly stopped and asked, "Do you promise you'll never have an affair?" If he had slapped my face, I don't think I would have been any more stunned. But before I had time to think, out came my angry reply. "Promises like that are made to be broken." "You're just like your father," he had retorted. "And one day you'll have an affair just like he did. If you loved me, you would have promised." Was this the explanation for his behavior in the bowling class? Was he still angry because I had refused to promise him not to ever have an affair? And if so, was his flirtatious behavior upon the bowling lanes his way of saying, "I don't need you. See how easy it is for me to pick up other girls"? If only I had had the courage to share with Paul my dedication, even if half-heartedly at times, in following the guidance of the inner voice. He knew nothing about how I had been inwardly led to the Eastgate Shopping Center laundromat where we had met, or how I had been told that he was to be my husband. Perhaps if I had shared this secret part of my life with Paul, it might have given him some amount of security concerning our relationship. I may not personally have felt a deep sense of commitment to Paul, but I still considered myself to be committed to the source of the inner voice and to its lessons. Right now, however, the lesson before me was looking pretty damn impossible. With each passing week of my marriage, I grew less and less hopeful that I would ever learn how to love this man who was, more than ever now, becoming the face of my enemy. I couldn't open my heart to such a man, but I did continue opening my legs to him. It was the only way I knew how to love a man when I didn't especially like him. Only once did I ever come close to considering that perhaps I was not using my body very wisely. It was towards the end of March. On this particular evening, as with so many of the previous evenings, I felt the insides of my body like a carbon-based sex machine springing into action upon the touch of Paul's roaming hand. It was easy to imagine at such times the message from my cerebral cortex, prepare for entry, flashing as lightning along the synapses of my body's central nervous system. But this night, vaginal lubrication wasn't the only thing oozing from the insides of my body. A small line of tears began to trickle from the outer corners of my eyes. The room was dark. I was on my back, waiting for Paul to notice the wetness upon my face. But he never did. Soon he was snoring upon his back, oblivious to the sadness that continued to seep from my eyes. Grabbing my pillow, I quickly but quietly made my way to the sofa in the living room, and there, curled into a fetal position upon a sofa that held no happy memories for me, I silently raged against the larger mind. "You have ruined my life," I inwardly screamed. "I trusted you, and look where it led. I'm in hell now, and it's all because of you." As I continued to cry into my pillow that was becoming uncomfortably wet by this time, my mind began to plan a new course of action. My father knew several attorneys. Tomorrow, I would give him a call and confess that yes, he had been right. I had rushed into a marriage with a young man I barely knew. It had all been a mistake, just as he had suspected, and now I wanted a divorce. Which of his attorney friends could he recommend to me? "Give it a year," came the soundless voice from within. "If your relationship has not improved within a year, you may leave him." "No," I silently transmitted to the source of the inner voice. "I don't want to be married. I would rather be single for the rest of my life. Go away. Leave me alone." And then came a wave of peace. I felt bathed in an invisible sea of light. My mind stilled. My tears stopped. And then I realized what was happening. "No," I protested. "Go away. I don't want to be soothed by you." But the wave of peace and calm continued. I felt like a kicking, screaming babe who had just been returned to her mother's arms. I turned over on my back, surrounded by the still unfamiliar dark shapes of Paul's fake wood furniture. And for the first time since we had returned from our honeymoon and holiday visits, I knew beyond a shade of a doubt that at some inner level, I had nothing to worry about. "All is well," came a signal from the deepest part of me, a signal without words, something I simply knew deep down in the core of my being. It was more akin to a wordless feeling than a thought, though stronger than any feeling I had ever experienced. Like a dreamer whose body is safe upon her bed no matter what monsters her sleeping mind may be conjuring, I too knew in this moment that at the deepest level of myself, I had no reason to worry or to fear. "Okay," I silently transmitted to the larger mind. "I'll give it a year." Then I got up and circled the date, March 23rd, on my kitchen calendar. That way, I would remember to circle this same date on my calendar in the new year to come. In the midst of my marital woes that winter and spring, the only bright spot beyond my weekend shift at WUNC was a photojournalism class I took in the final semester of my senior year of college. We young journalism students were expected to know how to shoot, produce, and develop in a darkroom black and white pictures of sporting events, cultural affairs, town council meetings, campus guest speakers, and any sort of special features image we could create using our single lens reflex cameras. For instance, a dog drinking from a city water fountain, or a man on an unseasonably warm winter's day licking an ice cream cone on Franklin Street in downtown Chapel Hill. Always I could depend upon the activities of this class to take my mind off of whatever disturbing circumstances existed in my relationship with Paul. I enjoyed venturing into the world with a camera in front of my face, taking pictures of whatever struck my fancy. I also enjoyed my time in the darkroom, watching my photographic creations magically appear upon the 8 by 10-inch sheets of glossy paper in the plastic tray of developing solution. Unfortunately, my professor did not share my high opinion of the photographic wonders I produced. Either the images in my pictures were not sharp enough, or the overall picture lacked enough contrast, or, as was usually the case, the subject matter of my photograph simply put my professor to sleep. We were told at the beginning of the semester that if our pictures were good enough to be printed in a newspaper, we would receive a letter grade of C. If we produced the sort of picture that, if published in a newspaper, might cause a husband to mutter to his wife over the breakfast table, "Look at this," we received a B. Only if we produced a high-quality image of something never before seen, something guaranteed to receive a "wow" from that husband or wife at the breakfast table, could we even hope to receive an A. Tired of receiving B's and C's for pictures that I had worked hard to produce, I decided that for my series of pictures in the final photojournalism project worth 50% of our grade, I would provide this professor with something never before seen. I arranged with the state's chief medical examiner, whose offices were located within the UNC Medical School, to photograph his work examining the dead bodies of individuals who had died under suspicious circumstances. Never before had the chief medical examiner of North Carolina received such a request from a journalism student. "Are you sure this would be appropriate for your class?" he asked. "Quite sure," I said. On the day I turned in my final photojournalism masterpiece, my professor's wide eyes revealed his shock. "How in the hell did you stomach taking these pictures?" he asked. "Well," I said, pausing a moment to consider, "when a person is dead, his or her body no longer looks real. It's as if the body, being unplugged from the current of life, takes on this plastic, sort of mannequin-like look. So it's more like you're taking pictures of a replica of the human body instead of the real thing." He turned to look at me. "You're heartless," he said, shaking his head. That may have been true, but I got my A. With all the failed attempts in loving my husband that term, it felt good, finally, to succeed in producing some kind of a positive outcome. However, I was more pleased by the extraordinary lesson I had learned as a result of that photojournalism class. As I had watched the medical examiner cutting open the abdomen of a dead woman, exactly my size and age, who had been killed in the flames of a burning house, I couldn't contain myself. "Oh my God!" I erupted, once he had sliced open the burnt black skin of her abdomen. "All those internal organs! They're stuffed into such a small amount of space, but they fit together so perfectly. The inside of the human body is a work of art," I said. The medical examiner, busy now, mumbled his response without looking up from his work. "Yes, I suppose you could say it's a work of art." Later, he determined the cause of death. It was not murder. "She had too much to drink and passed out," he said. "And when the house caught fire, it was the smoke inhalation that killed her." "Is that why her lungs are so black?" I asked. Or is it because she was a smoker? This is how the lungs of all of us look when we live in an area like this, heavily populated, lots of car traffic, he said. Yet another lesson I learned from my final photojournalism assignment. Later, after I stopped by the medical examiner's office to share with him all of the pictures I had submitted to my professor, he said, "You have a talent for this. Your pictures are compelling. Have you considered photography as a profession?" I laughed. "No," I said, "but thank you for the compliment." My professor's reactions to my pictures, I had decided, were probably the norm. Either folks would be bored or appalled by how I saw the world. My plan after graduation was to find a relatively easy, temporary weekday job that would supplement my income since I wanted to continue working as a part-time weekend announcer at WUNC. I knew that eventually one of the weekday announcers at the station would leave, and I could move up the public radio ladder to work as a full-time classical music announcer. It was the only job I now desired. Though the J School at UNC had provided me with the means of facing my fear of writing, and though I had, thanks to one of my final journalism classes, discovered the inner beauty of the human body, and also the sad fact that most of us have black lungs, yet another major lesson I had learned in my final year of journalism was that I did not want to work as a reporter. I didn't like dealing with deadlines, and I didn't enjoy the news. Most of what occurred in the world held no interest for me. The same human dramas, I believed, were being reenacted over and over and over again, which is why I had decided that I really liked the ancient biblical text Ecclesiastes. Although I no longer had as much time for Bible reading, I was still making my way ever but slowly through the texts of the ancient Hebrew Bible that Christians commonly refer to as the Old Testament. My progress was made even slower by the fact that since I was irritated by Paul's pride in the many biblical passages he had memorized as a young person, I didn't want him to know about my secret passion, and so my Bible never strayed from the shelf whenever he was home. However, if I had been a single woman at that time, I am sure I would have displayed upon my refrigerator the following scripture from the first chapter of Ecclesiastes. "All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after wind." Like King Solomon, traditionally known as the author of this text, I neither trusted nor respected the ways of the world, which is why the thought of reporting on the nothing new events in the world seemed pointless to me. Until my dream job at WUNC became available, I wanted the sort of weekday job that provided me with a reasonably pleasant but quiet, somewhat hidden from the world existence. True, I was working at a public radio station on the weekends, and some might say such a job exposed me to public attention. But hardly any of our listeners knew or cared about who I was or what I looked like. When I worked my weekend shifts at the radio station, I was nothing more than a disembodied voice floating among the public airwaves. I liked that sort of invisibility. It made me feel safe in a world that I neither trusted nor respected, a world filled with so much striving after wind that it seemed perpetually tipped towards chaos. I may have been the only student in the UNC School of Journalism who, upon graduation in the spring of 1983, was busily searching the classifieds for non-journalistic forms of employment. Most of the jobs I applied for involved answering the telephone. I figured that since I was already a voice, I might as well continue working as such. But over and over again, I was told the same thing. "I'm afraid you're overqualified for this position." Once, after being informed yet again in an interview that I was overqualified, I asked the plump and pleasant woman in a peach-colored blazer and matching skirt, "If I'm overqualified, why, may I ask, did you invite me in for an interview?" She chuckled. "Oh, I was just curious," she said. "You're so different on paper than any of our other applicants. I wanted to find out why you applied for this job." I explained my reasons: my love of WUNC, my desire to eventually obtain a full-time position at the station, and my need for temporary work until that position became available. She seemed satisfied by my answer. "Oh, yes," she said, "now I understand." But not enough to change her mind concerning my compatibility for her company's advertised job. I didn't understand why I, a part-time professional voice, could be overqualified for a job answering the telephone. But I accepted my defeat and continued searching for a temporary full-time job. Within a week, the phone rang again. This time, it was my former boss from the periodicals department at Wilson Library. Now it made perfect sense why I had been rejected by all those other companies. Surely a larger force had been steering me to this particular job. It would be a perfect fit. I had enjoyed my 2 summers of work in the periodicals department, where, towards the end of my shift each day, sitting at the information desk, the orangey rose glow of the late afternoon sun would filter its way through the deep green branches of the nearby oaks outside the library's tall windows. This beautiful glow filled and transformed the space of my work environment into the most inviting room imaginable, where every chair seemed to beckon, "Come, sit and read, and be filled with the peace of a summer day's end." The following afternoon, I stepped into one of the cubicles bordered by shelves of metal bookcases that filled the back office space of the periodicals department. The director gave me a big smile. "Thank you so much for coming in," she said. "Please," motioning to a chair beside her small desk, "take a seat." Shuffling through one of 2 piles of papers upon her desk, she stopped to focus on a particular sheet which I assumed was my application. My heart hummed in anticipation. "Shelley," she said, and slowly her eyebrows drew together over the top of her thin wire-rimmed glasses. "There seems to be a problem." She tilted her head to one side, like a cat who is confused. "I see here that you applied for the job we recently advertised." "Yes," I said. A flash of warmth filled my forehead and cheeks. "Why is this a problem?" I asked. "I enjoyed working here, and I was asked to return for a second summer. I assumed everyone here was pleased with my work." "We were," she said. Carefully, she placed the single sheet so that it was perfectly positioned at the top of the smallest stack of papers on her desk. Clasping her hands together, both elbows at the edge of her desk, she added, "But according to your application, you have a degree in journalism." "And what's wrong with that?" I asked, embarrassed that the sensation of heat in my face had not yet dissipated. Was the journalism school tainted in some way that I had not known? I thought you knew that those of us who work here full time have degrees in library science, she said. No, I said, I didn't know that. When I worked here, I often worked beside the full-time employees. We did the same work together. Doesn't my experience count for anything? Experience alone is fine when it comes to part-time or seasonal work, but all of our full-time positions must be filled by someone who holds a library science degree. Now, she paused for a moment, if you're interested in full-time library work, I would suggest that you pursue a master's degree in library science. That way we could consider you for our next available position. Well, I said, still trying to recover from my shock. Thank you for that suggestion. I'll certainly look into the library science program. I'm sorry, though, that I didn't know beforehand about your policy. She gave me a kind but sad smile. No need to apologize. You were one of our best summer employees. I felt I owed you a face-to-face meeting. Thank you, I said. I got up to shake her hand, and then I made my way to the exit, waving to each of the employees I knew so well. These were the people beside whom I had encoded by hand the library's new titles and corresponding catalog numbers upon the large green and white striped computer printout sheets that were updated daily. These were the people with whom I had manned the information desk, and for whom I had bound stacks of newspapers for recycling. I had also searched for lost books in the stacks, and I had checked to make sure the shelved periodicals were in their proper order. And because I truly liked all of these people who waved to me in return, and because I had truly enjoyed working in this quiet, peaceful space, I did seriously consider pursuing a master's degree in library science until the following afternoon, when I came across a list of descriptions for every class that would be required for such a degree. To my great disappointment, each course description read like a magical incantation for a sleeping draught. So I continued my search for a temporary full-time job, and week after week, for the remainder of the summer, I was rejected or ignored by every single company I contacted. Was I really that bad of a job candidate? All summer long, I had resolutely avoided advertised jobs in the classifieds that had anything to do with journalism. However, by the end of August, feeling panicky and afraid that I might never be able to find a weekday job, I called in response to an ad for a news reporting job at Chapel Hill's only AM station, WCHL. The next day, I found myself seated across a large table from the station's two news directors, one who had recently been hired and the other who would soon be retiring. My heart began to thump. I do not want this job. I do not want this job, my mind repeated as a silent mantra. And suddenly, I knew the real reason I had not, upon graduation, pursued a job in journalism. I had been trying to avoid writing. Yes, I had faced my fear of writing as a journalism student, but I had never grown to love writing. In fact, I now realized with a sudden horror, I hated writing. The thought of having to get back into writing filled me with dread. Why in the hell was I pretending to be interested in a job I already knew I would hate? Was I really that desperate for employment? Yes, I realized, I was. I needed the extra income, most especially if my marriage was doomed, as I was assuming it was. And I had by this time lost all hope of finding the sort of job I really wanted, something quiet and uncomplicated in a relatively peaceful environment where I might even find a few spare moments to read. The summer before, while working at the periodicals department at Wilson Library, a librarian by the name of Peter had informed me that no matter where he went, he always carried a small paperback book. That way, if he happened to be in a restaurant waiting for an order of food or standing in line at the DMV, he could utilize what would have been wasted time by reading. Impressed by the number of books I had witnessed Peter reading each weekday when it was our turn to man the information desk, I had quickly adopted his practice. No matter where I went now, I always carried a paperback book with me. Even while working at WUNC, during the long symphonies or concertos I played on the air, I would read from whatever book I had shoved into my purse for that day. This doubled the pleasure of my weekend announcing job. What could be more fun than listening to the music that I loved while reading an enjoyable book? But there would be no time for extra reading while working as a reporter. A part of me cringed as each of the two news directors across the table from me described what a significant role the news department at WCHL played within the community. Other than the local paper, we're the only ones covering what's happening here in Chapel Hill. The town council meetings, the local elections, crime reports, high school football, said the older of the two men before me. He was tall and thin, black glasses and thin gray hair that he swept over the top of his head to cover a bald spot. Supposedly, he had been a newsman in the Chapel Hill area for a number of years. He had always loved covering the news of Chapel Hill. "It's a great community," he said. The man seemed to never stop smiling, even when he wasn't talking. The younger news director, who oozed with a serious but passionate demeanor that reminded me of Dan Rather, CBS's anchorman replacement for the legendary Walter Cronkite, confessed that he was a true news hound. He had fallen in love with the news back in high school, he said. "Shelley, are you a news hound too?" he asked. I stumbled. "Well, there have certainly been many topics I've reported on in the past that were of great interest to me." I was referring to those times when, for instance, during my research for the bulimia paper, I had genuinely enjoyed collecting data on the subject via research at the library and the personal interviews I had conducted. "Great," he said, though I knew that I was not the news hound he and the other news director appeared to be. These were men who probably enjoyed listening to police scanners, who wanted to be at the scene of a fire or a car accident, and who even enjoyed knowing what new trash collection routes had been adopted by city council. Oh my God, I thought, what have I gotten myself into? But I knew I needed a job, so I continued giving them the sort of answers I thought they would like to hear, even if my attempts were, to my mind, only half-hearted. This job, I now told myself, would be better than waiting tables, as I had done for 2 summers as a high school student. And it's not like I couldn't do the work. I had, after all, been trained as a journalist, and I had successfully faced my fear of writing. I knew how to write, even if I didn't enjoy writing. "So," said the younger of the two news directors, whose dark hair, serious eyes, and wide, square jaw were beginning to remind me more and more of Dan Rather, "are you ready to join the CHL news team?" Holy tamale! Weren't they supposed to wait a few days before making an offer? Geez, I thought, they must be desperate. "Would it be a problem that I have a weekend job at WUNC? I asked. Oh, no, said the older of the two news directors. He had heard me once, he had told me, on the air at WUNC, when I'd been delivering news headlines at the top of the hour during my music shift. He had liked the sound of my voice, he said. And they both liked the fact that I had a journalism degree from UNC. How shocked they would have been to know that a graduate from the UNC J School was sitting across the table from them now, full of dread at the thought of having to write again. Glancing back and forth from the face of the young Dan Rather to the grandfatherly face of the gray-haired news director, I watched as their smiles slowly began to fade. I knew I was taking too long to answer. How long would my stories have to be? I asked, looking for yet another delay tactic. No more than 30 to 60 seconds apiece, said the grandfatherly news director. 30 to 60 seconds per story. Surely I could handle that. There actually wouldn't be much required writing at all, I decided, especially if I filled a portion of my 30 to 60 second stories with clips from my recorded interviews. That was the nice thing about broadcast journalism. In comparison to print journalism, not as much writing was required. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. I opened my mouth. Both news directors leaned towards me, elbows on the table. Thank you, I said at last, trying my best to sound thankful for a job I didn't really want. I'll take it. Both their faces flashed with renewed smiles. Great, said the younger of the two news directors, whose voice I now realized also made me think of Dan Rather. We need you to begin right away, he said. Can you be here tomorrow at 9? Sure, I said with a smile that I hoped conveyed a proper amount of eagerness for a job I didn't want. Outside the front entrance of WCHL's office, I could feel my heart sinking down to my feet. I was back in the throes of journalism, daily deadlines, shoving microphones into the faces of strangers for interviews, and all that writing about topics that, for the most part, seemed so insignificant. How was it that, after deciding not to work as a reporter, I was now going to be actively hunting nothing new events to report upon each week? Why had I just accepted a job I knew I didn't want? Foolish girl, I muttered to my reflection in my car's rearview mirror. My only consoling thought as I drove home was that eventually I would have my dream job at WUNC. This new job I had just accepted was only temporary. Soon I would be announcing classical music each weekday, listening to the music that I loved while reading, in between my on-air breaks, whatever books had caught my fancy for that week. No job could be more perfect. And once I had my dream job, never again would I have to face another news deadline or shove another microphone into the face of a stranger. And, above all else, never again would my fingers ever be forced to click upon the keys of a typewriter, stringing together words into sentences. The nothing new events I reported upon for WCHL included stories about the local political races, city council meetings, crime reports, and holiday celebrations. And though in the beginning I woke up each morning dreading whatever nothing new events I would be reporting upon that day, I soon discovered that deadlines were indeed no longer the big deal they had been in college. Writing a 30 to 60 second news story was far less work than my weekly journalism papers had been, most especially when I filled those 30 to 60 seconds with recorded comments from whichever expert I had chosen to interview for that day. The interviewed expert, whether a member of city council or a chimney sweep, wasn't important. Such a voice was nothing more than fill material for the story. What really mattered was the sound of my voice, a tone of confident authority, even if nothing more than an act, counted more than content. With the proper inflections, even a boring story such as preparing one's chimney for the wintertime could be made to sound like the day's top story, which led me to conclude that broadcast news was really nothing more than a theatrical production. Although my dislike for writing continued to exist as a shadow in the back of my mind, by the end of my second week, I found that I was enjoying the performance aspect of my job. It reminded me of the days when back in high school I had acted upon a stage. To my listeners, I might have sounded like a serious reporter informing them about serious matters, but I now saw myself as nothing more than an actor playing the role of narrator in the ongoing nothing new dramas of humanity. And because this new job of play acting was fun, my distrust of the world, along with my desire to keep a safe distance from it, soon evaporated. Yes, I still agreed with the author of Ecclesiastes that all the world was vanity and a striving after wind, but now I found myself leaning more towards Shakespeare's philosophy that all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. Why be withdrawn from the world when you can have a bit of fun playing a role upon its stage? By the following spring, I was so busy performing my new role of radio reporter during the week and my old role of classical music announcer on the weekends that I almost forgot about the circled date on the calendar, March 23rd, the date that marked a full year since I had received the soundless inner message, "If your relationship has not improved within a year, you may leave." On the morning I turned to the March page of my kitchen calendar and saw the circled date, I sat for a moment at Paul's laminate-topped kitchen table and pondered my situation. Was it time for me to leave? Now that a whole year had passed since that awful night on the living room sofa, I had to admit that my relationship with Paul had improved. True, the improvement was only minimal, but I couldn't deny that our manner towards each other had softened. Perhaps this was because my new job of play acting had made me happier, and therefore a more pleasant person for Paul to be around. Or maybe it was that my 2 radio jobs kept me so busy that I had no time to clean our apartment, and therefore not as much time to notice or to care about Paul's chaotic piles of clutter. My nagging and insulting criticisms toward Paul lessened, and maybe he appreciated that. My disturbing dreams about our relationship still continued, but now I took the dreams as a sign that our relationship would eventually end at some point in the future, after we had learned our spiritual lessons. Because there had been a slight improvement in our marriage, I assumed that meant that the 2 former enemies were slowly beginning to make their peace with each other, and after this peace was complete, I assumed we would part as friends and go our separate ways, Paul upon his career path, and I upon my own career path. I knew that, like most of my fellow humans, I had walked out upon the world's stage, playing a role that was nothing more than vanity and striving after wind. But it became such a fun role for me to play that soon my grip upon the idea of my dream job at WUNC loosened, and my game plan changed. Now I wanted to finish out the year at WCHL and then begin a search for a bigger, better radio news job at one of the FM stations in nearby Raleigh or Durham. And if Gary Shivers, the station manager at WUNC, opened those doors for me at NPR as he had once promised to do, then maybe one day I might even become the next Susan Stamberg, anchoring NPR's All Things Considered. It was, I now told myself, a good thing that I had turned down the weekday early morning news announcing job I had been offered at WUNC. If I had taken that job, I would have been delivering the regional and state news every weekday morning, but the written copy for every single story would have come off the wire, the news service provided to all station subscribers. I knew, however, that in order to make a real name for myself in the game of news, I needed to expand my role a bit, to truly act the part of a news hound by hitting the pavement and gathering my own stories from scratch. But I also needed, I decided, more sensational stories, the kind of stories that might cause a husband to say to his wife at the end of the day, "Wow, did you hear the story about such and such?" This is why I was so pleased when I was assigned a story that was sure to be a sensation, the trial of Amy Rigsby. Most of the stories at the station, now that it was spring, were about local dog shows, the opening of a new business, or how to protect yourself from ticks. I felt honored that I, the newest of WCHL's 3 reporters, had been given the responsibility of covering the trial of Amy Rigsby. Amy had been charged with the physical assault of a 6-year-old boy. Up until the moment she was charged with this assault, she had provided after-school daycare for a handful of children in her home. On the first day of her trial, as soon as Amy was led into the courtroom, I recognized her immediately. She was one of the gray-headed church ladies who had provided food at a political rally of Pastor Jim White, the lay minister of a conservative Methodist church in Carborough, North Carolina, who had decided to run for mayor. Not only had I disliked the anti-progressive views of Pastor Jim, whose political campaign I had been given the charge of covering, I had not especially liked one of the older women standing behind a table serving food at the rally. She was the one with the pudgy bulldog face, the small dark eyes, and the thin, tight mouth whose corners always seemed pointed toward the floor. As I had walked away with my paper plate of food, I remember thinking, if she had a cigarette dangling from her mouth, the effect of her face would be complete. When I saw that it was this very same woman who had been charged with the physical assault of a young boy, I thought, well, of course. I knew beyond any shade of a doubt that she was guilty. And as the trial progressed, the physical evidence against her mounted. The most incriminating evidence of all was the testimony given by physician after physician, state medical examiners, and local coroners that a spiral-bound fracture, which is what X-rays revealed the break in the boy's arm to have been, could only have been caused by a strong and repeated shaking of the young boy's arm. The trial lasted for 4 days. At the end of each day's session, I would go into an office of the Hillsborough County Courthouse and phone in my hastily handwritten story to the Dan Rather lookalike, the youngest of my 2 news directors. He would record my voice onto an 8-track tape, which would then be played during the evening's half hour of news, sports, and weather. Because my story received top billing, minutes after I exited the courthouse, I was able to hear my own voice on my car's AM radio delivering the story of Amy's ongoing trial. It was so obvious, not only from the facts I gave, but most especially from the condemning tone of my voice, that Amy Rigsby was guilty, even if a verdict had not yet been delivered. On the last day of the trial, I stood in the back of the courtroom, gazing out upon the crowded collection of court watchers and reporters who were waiting for that clap of a gavel that meant Amy's trial had resumed. Suddenly, I became aware of the energy of eager anticipation that filled the entire room. Folks are really enjoying this trial, I realized. Then I was struck by another thought. It's as if all of us in this room are transmitting a silent message. Burn the witch! Burn the witch! Everyone at the trial had assumed right from the beginning that Amy was guilty as hell. We could see it on her angry, defensive face. We could hear it in the testimony that had been given. Even the positive character witness testimony had been weak. It had amounted to nothing more than a few of her gray-headed church lady friends testifying under oath. Amy could never have done such a thing. She's a true Christian lady. All of us, every single one of us in that courtroom, wanted to see Amy pay for what she had done to an innocent little boy. How dare she? People like that should be locked away. Burn the witch were the silent words that continued to bat around us in the courtroom. Then came an insight that pierced my heart and left me feeling stunned. Every single one of us in that room, I suddenly realized, was capable of shaking too hard the arm of a little boy who wasn't doing what he was supposed to do. And since we were all capable of what Amy had done, we were all, therefore, guilty. It hadn't yet happened to us, but it could. That's why everyone was enjoying Amy's trial so much. Better her than us, we were all thinking. If she paid for this crime, then maybe we would never find ourselves in her situation. In that moment, I also realized that Amy was indeed exactly as her gray-headed church lady friends had testified. She was a true Christian lady. She went to church every Sunday. She publicly professed her Christian beliefs each week. She baked pies and served on committees. She cleaned the church kitchen after the weekly spaghetti dinners on Sundays. She was one of those members of a church that folks could depend upon, and yet she had made a mistake. Suddenly it was as if a great weight was upon me. None of us, I thought to myself, had any right to judge Amy. She could very easily be each and every one of us. But we didn't want to be reminded of that, so we placed an invisible wall between herself and us. She was bad, we were good. Burn the witch. As I stared at the back of Amy Rigsby's gray grandmotherly head, I felt like I could have cried. Amy didn't have children of her own. Her husband was dead. She'd been caring for a group of kids as a way of supplementing her late husband's Social Security. True, she probably didn't have the best disposition for a child care provider, but the money had been good, better than what she would have made working as a clerk at the local A&P. And besides that, watching kids in her own home had meant she didn't have to stand on her feet for long hours at a time. But now it was beginning to look as if she would be spending some, if not all, of her last years in a prison. Suddenly I was filled with the strong urge to write about Amy from this newfound perspective, I could help others to feel the compassion for her that I was now feeling. And perhaps if she really did go to prison, I could visit her on occasion and maybe even write a follow-up story about her. At the very least, I could be her friend. Those little old ladies from her church, the ones who had testified that Amy could never have broken the arm of a little boy, they would probably not be traveling to the state prison to visit her. The growing feeling erupting within me now like an invisible geyser was that Amy needed a friend. Write this new kind of a story about Amy, the erupting geyser from within me seemed to be saying, while every molecule in my body seemed to be responding with a resounding yes. My heart hummed in anticipation. I felt surrounded by an energy of love, as if the eyes of heaven were upon me. Such a beautiful idea. It might very well have produced some beautiful results, if not for the next instant when I was seized by the cold, dark grip of fear. Did I want to be the one single reporter who became associated with the witch? Did I want to stand out in this way? It was okay to stand out as a good-sounding radio voice on the air, but to come forward publicly in writing as a person who had compassion for a woman who had broken the arm of a little boy? Would people think that I supported this kind of violence against children? I couldn't take the chance. I wasn't brave enough. The story I wrote about Amy's trial that day was like all my other stories about her case. There was only one difference, the fact that it had a definitive conclusion. On that day in the Hillsborough County Courthouse, Amy received a verdict of guilty. She would indeed be heading to prison. "She's guilty as hell, here are the facts," were the gist of my story that day. The only compassionate concession I made was that I withheld one piece of evidence against Amy. The mother of another boy in Amy's care, just before knocking on the front door one afternoon to retrieve her son, had overheard Amy's angry voice through the door. "God damn it, I told you to shut up!" I left that fact out of my story. The younger of my two news directors, the Dan Rather lookalike, was livid the next day when he discovered through another news source that I had left out a key piece of damning evidence against Amy. "What's wrong with you?" he yelled. "I felt sorry for her," I said. "Things were bad enough for her. I didn't want her situation to be worse." "It's not your job to feel sorry for folks," he said. "You're here to report the news. I expect the facts, all the facts. Do you understand?" "Yes," I said, "I understand." But what neither of us understood, because not until the end of the day would this fact be revealed, was that I had lost my ability to write. At first, I thought the writer's block was temporary, akin to a pesky cold virus, but the condition continued with each passing day. Although I could scribble notes and shove microphones into people's faces, asking them appropriate questions, whenever I tried to write my stories based upon all my collected data, the words upon the narrow pages of my reporter's notepad became as gibberish to me, nothing more than lines of blah, blah, blah. "Oh my God," I would think each time, "there's nothing here to write about." And then, because I was trying to keep my problem a secret from the folks at WCHL, I would rush to Paul, wherever he was, at home or at his office on campus, and ask for his help. After reading through my scribbled notes, he would locate the lead to my story and then show me, one by one, all the other facts that needed to be included. One night he pointed to New sidewalk on Rosemary Street approved. A line from my notes, which I then circled. That's your lead, he said. Then pointing to another line, he said, follow with this. I made another circle. And then you can close with this. Yet another circle. And all of that, combined with your recorded interviews, should be enough for a 30-second story. Yes, 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 I would think each time I drove back to the station with Paul's outline. Such a simple story. Why had I not been able to see it on my own? What in the hell was wrong with me? During one of my panicked daytime visits to Paul's office, I caught him in an animated conversation with a giggly, big-boobed young woman whose round face radiated the telltale glow of infatuation. Yes, he later admitted, I suppose she has a bit of a crush on me. Too concerned about my job to worry about whatever friendships Paul was developing, I quickly dismissed her. My writer's block problem was growing worse with each passing week. By now, when I sought Paul's help, I also had to ask, will you please write my intro? The words just aren't coming. One day, back in the newsroom of WCHL, on the verge of recording a story which Paul had, due to my worsening condition, written completely on his own, I glanced beyond the glass window of the newsroom into the nearby announcer's studio. The station's music format was top 40. As always, the announcer was laughing, joking this time with the next shift announcer who had just stepped in to relieve her. In the announcer's booth, there were always jokes and laughter, on the air and off. That afternoon, I found myself thinking, I'm in the wrong studio. Silently, I prayed to the larger mind, please, I need help. The next day, I received a phone call from Craig Curtis, the music director at my beloved public radio station, WUNC. Assuming initially that he was calling with an offer for full-time employment, my heart broke when instead I heard his deep, rich voice solemnly intone, if you want a full-time shift at the station, I recommend that you quit your weekend shift and find a full-time salaried position at another station. This will prove that your voice is marketable and therefore of more value to our station. Show us that you have a voice people want to hear. Although it is true that my voice was on the air every weekday at WCHL, I have often wondered if my friends back at WUNC did not like the sound of my reporter's voice. On the air at WUNC, I spoke as my natural self, but for all the news stories I produced at CHL, I was an actress on a stage, play acting a role. Perhaps, I remember thinking, it's hard for a voice to be beautiful if it's not natural. Now more than anything, I was back to yearning for a full-time position as a classical announcer. With no ability to write, I couldn't continue play acting my role of news reporter. I trusted Craig, and I very much admired him. He was the one whose beautiful French horn music had made my grandmother cry during my wedding ceremony. But I also remembered my prayer to the larger mind the day before. Could Craig's advice be the help I had asked for? More than likely it was, I decided. And that is why I took his advice. After searching the radio dial in both the AM and FM frequencies, I decided that my voice would blend well with the big band Music of Your Life format at WDNC, the AM station in nearby Durham that featured the weekly broadcasts of the popular minor league Durham Bulls baseball games. I mailed the station an audition tape and a resume, and by the end of the week I was called in for an interview. Within an hour, I was offered a job. Luckily, one of their announcers had recently resigned. If I took the job, my regular shift would be Monday through Friday, 6 to 10 p.m., and I would be in charge of the nightly request hour when the elderly folks of the Raleigh-Durham Chapel Hill area called in to request those tunes that had played on the radio when they were young and in love. "I'll take it," I told the program director, and I submitted my 2 weeks' notice to both WUNC and WCHL. Although my news was well received by Craig, who was pleased to hear that I had so quickly landed a full-time salaried position in radio, my news was not so well received by the young Dan Rather lookalike, my news director at CHL. "I don't understand," he said. "Why are you leaving the news? You're such a natural. I thought you liked it here." Too embarrassed to tell him the truth, that I had lost my ability to write, I lied. "I can't afford to continue working here for such low pay," I said, knowing that there was absolutely no chance I would be offered a raise. There were too many journalism majors at the university who, desperate for broadcast news experience, would have loved to take my place. "Well, I'm sorry to hear that," he said. "Good luck with your new job." At my news station, WDNC, I became friends with the Durham Bulls baseball announcer Steve Pratt. Sometimes, before attending a Saturday game, Paul and I would go out to dinner with Steve. Though I had never been much of a sports fan, now that I knew a highly enthusiastic sportscaster for an actual team, baseball became interesting. An interest which spiked after the Durham Bulls came to be featured in the movie Bull Durham, starring Kevin Costner and Susan Sarandon. Being loosely connected to a minor league baseball team was fun, but it was not nearly as much fun as having so many new grandmothers and grandfathers. They called me each weekday evening to ask that their favorite songs be played during the request hour, that always ended up stretching to 2 hours. I didn't have the heart to confine requests to only 1 hour, most especially when the callers were such sweet-sounding old men and women. One grandmother crocheted me an Afghan in her nursing home. The box with the Afghan arrived at the station for me one day. Another listener, a grandfather, invited Paul and me over for an afternoon of tea and cookies one Saturday. I am sure this particular grandfather assumed that Paul and I were a happy couple. That was the image we projected, probably because we thought it would be pleasing for an old man to spend time with two happy young people. How surprised he would have been to learn that my relationship with Paul was anything but hunky-dory. Though I didn't understand why our marriage had sunk again into the fiery subduction zone. Perhaps it was because I no longer needed Paul as a ghostwriter for my news stories. Or maybe it was because we had been gassed out of our old apartment after an exterminator made a mistake and sprayed undiluted industrial-strength insecticide throughout all of our kitchen, causing us both to suffer from headache pain and dizziness. Or maybe it was simply the strange vibe of our new apartment. Whatever the reason for our marital dip into the deep, our relationship grew more tense with each passing day. Once again, I found myself awakening from the dream, the one about Paul and that other woman. Though I could never see her clearly, I always knew it was the same woman I had been dreaming of for over 2 years now. Each time I awakened from this dream, I would angrily demand of Paul, "Are you having an affair?" His answer was always the same, "No, you're crazy." Soon, even I began to suspect yet again that I might be insane. Up until this point in my life, my experience with the soundless inner voice had been infrequent, and only once, when I had felt I had received a message from my dead grandmother Alice, had a message from within not been soundless. It was easy for me to push these experiences to the back burner of my brain and almost pretend that they had never occurred. But after Paul and I moved into our new apartment, I began to experience an ongoing auditory hallucination that was beginning to freak me out. It always happened when I was alone in our new apartment, long before it was time for me to leave for my early evening shift at WDNC, usually in the early afternoon. At least once a week, it seemed, I would begin to feel my brain shifting gears. There would be a deepening sensation, as if my brain were traveling down an elevator, becoming more and more relaxed. And then, when this imaginary elevator had reached its lowest point, it felt as if I were standing in a large but invisible auditorium filled with hundreds of people, all busily engaged in hundreds of simultaneous conversations all around me. I could hear these voices. They had sound. The first time this happened, I wasn't scared. My brain felt too relaxed to be scared. Instead, I was only curious. What in the world was I hearing? Was I somehow tapping into a small portion of the collective unconscious? Were these the many minds of people living all around me in Chapel Hill? That was my initial assumption, but I wanted to actually focus my attention upon one single voice. I thought if I could hear and understand one voice, I might better understand my experience. But as hard as I tried to capture a single voice with my auditory focus, I was never able to decipher anything other than the sex of a particular voice here and there. Soon I began to enter into this trance-like state of listening to these mysterious voices with increasing frequency, and I would try each time to allow my mind to remain with the voices for longer and longer durations. Surely, I thought, if I could remain with these voices for just a little bit longer, I would at last be able to make out a particular voice and hear what was being said, a sentence, or even a single word. That's what I was listening for. But I could never understand any of the voices, no matter how long I remained with them. One time, it happened as I was vacuuming our apartment. Once again, I was alone. Once again, it was the early afternoon. I could feel my mind beginning to lower itself into a deeper, more relaxed state. So I turned off my vacuum cleaner and stood in the middle of our living room and waited for the voices. This time, I decided, I would stay in the auditorium of voices until I heard something I could understand. I don't really know how long I remained beside my vacuum cleaner that day, surrounded by what felt like a sea of voices in this invisible auditorium, but at some point I knew intuitively that if I stayed in this deepened state too much longer, I might not be able to return to my normal mental state. I would remain trapped in the sea of voices forevermore, unaware of the passage of time, trying over and over again to decipher what was being said. Did I want to remain with these voices, trying to solve this maddening mystery? Or did I want to return to normal, even if it meant returning to my unhappy marriage in an apartment that also felt unhappy? I decided it was time for me to return, but when I attempted to snap my mind back into its normal state of being, to my horror, I discovered I was stuck. Oh no! Had I stayed in the sea of voices for too long? In desperation now, feeling trapped, I shouted out to the sea of voices surrounding me. "No!" I said. And in that instant, my mind returned to normal, and I somehow knew that the voices were gone for good. I have never heard the voices since that day, but I have often wondered, had I not returned to a normal mental state, would my mind have permanently become ensnared in a state of catatonic stupor? I don't know. It was certainly something I didn't want to think about then, but one thing that continued to occupy my mind was the strange, somewhat creepy feeling energy of our apartment. Had we not been so desperate to find a new place after we had been gassed out of our old apartment, I doubt I would have chosen to live there. I had by this time gone back to sleeping occasionally on the sofa in the living room. Sometimes when I was out on the sofa, I would be awakened in the middle of the night by the sound of someone walking behind me in the dining room area. We had the sofa positioned in the middle of the room, serving as a divide between the dining room area and the living room area. Back and forth came the sound of shuffling steps upon the carpet. Too fearful to call out to Paul for help, and too fearful to actually brave a peek over the top of the sofa towards the dining room area to see who it was, I would pull my knees to my chest and squeeze my eyes shut, my pillow against my face, a blanket pulled tight over my head, just as I had once done as a child when I would stifle my screams after I had seen a scary image in the dark. With my pillow and blanket armor shielding my eyes from the possibility of seeing anything in our apartment that wasn't supposed to be there, I always managed eventually to fall back to sleep, just as I had when I was a child. And when I awakened in the morning to see the sun's rays peeping through the curtains of our living room, I would try to convince myself that everything I had experienced the night before had been nothing more than a dream. Looking back on this time, I think how amusing it might have been if it was Paul all along on those creepy nights, sleepwalking in the dining room area, trying his best in his sleep to get closer to me. But there is another possibility. An old woman had lived in the apartment before us. Though I had not asked for details when the building's manager had once mentioned her, I often suspected that she had died in our apartment. If so, it might have been her spirit I heard pacing back and forth behind the sofa where I lay in the living room. As a teenager, I had heard and seen such a spirit pacing the upstairs hallway of an old house my family had once lived in. Though at first this ghostly form of a man had scared the shit out of me, as he continued to pace night after night in the upstairs hallway, I became used to him. It got to the point where I would open my door in the middle of the night after I had been awakened yet again by the sound of all that pacing, and I would angrily hiss, "Stop your pacing!" Always the pacing would stop, and I was able to get back to sleep. Never, though, in our new apartment, was I ever able to bravely hiss, "Stop your pacing!" I have no explanation for my extreme fear, since I had been so brave as a teenager facing a pacing ghost in an upstairs hallway. But the fact that I was still occasionally willing to go out to the scary living room to avoid sleeping with Paul is an indication of how unpleasant our relationship had become. Frequently, I found myself wishing that he would leave. That particular wish was amplified the afternoon Paul came home to discover a neighbor, a college undergrad, talking to me in our apartment. This young neighbor of ours, having only recently moved in, had knocked on the door with a request. He needed to use our phone since his was not yet connected. This was, of course, years before individuals in this country would come to carry personal, pocket-sized cell phones. The instant I saw this young neighbor at the door, I liked him and felt that I could trust him. His California surfer dude, laid back manner of speaking, his blonde bedhead hair. He didn't stay long, but he was in the process of thanking me, standing just in front of our door, when Paul happened to walk in. The moment Paul saw the young man, his green eyes blazed with a look of jealousy. After the young man left, I explained to Paul the reason for his visit, but Paul's only response was to stomp over to my large green penny jar perched on a low plant stand and kick the hell out of it. I had always loved the beauty of that gracefully shaped big-bottomed glass jar, which I had once used as a terrarium for small plants back when I was in high school. I couldn't believe that my green glass penny jar was now a broken heap upon the floor, pennies spilling like guts around the shards of green glass. I can't remember exactly what I screamed. I'm sure it was something along the lines of, "You goddamn fucking bastard!" But I do remember that the next thing I screamed was, "I'm leaving!" Out the door I flew, and I drove around the countryside outside of Chapel Hill for many hours. My mind was in a rage. How could he have kicked my penny jar? Why had he been so angry? I hadn't done anything. It's not like I was having an affair. Sure, there were guys that I sometimes felt attracted to, but the young undergrad who had asked to use our phone? He was too young, too clueless, too much like a cute but innocent little bear cub for me to take seriously as a potential sexual partner. I knew that if I had an affair, it would be with someone older, someone more mature, someone far wiser than my asshole of a husband who had just smashed my penny jar. At some point during my hours of driving that evening, I finally decided that I did not want to be the one who left. Paul would have to be the one to play that role. I didn't want my soul to be burdened at the end of my life with the extra baggage of this particular unlearned spiritual lesson. So I had returned, hoping more than ever now that Paul would soon announce he was leaving. If he left, the end of our relationship would be his fault, not mine. And therefore, I assumed, the burden of our unlearned spiritual lesson would fall upon his shoulders. Already I felt weighted down by what I considered to be my unlearned lesson from the trial of Amy Rigsby. Why else had my ability to write been taken away from me? Now especially, I did not want the additional weight of yet another spiritual burden. I would wait it out. Surely, in a year or so, Paul would announce that he was leaving. One morning, not too long after the penny jar incident, which, to Paul's credit, he had tried in vain to write with a bottle of glue and mounds of overlapping lines of tape, I was lounging in bed, happy to be by myself. Paul was already on campus for the day, and I had slept in since I wouldn't have to leave for my job until late that afternoon. As usual, I was staring up at the ceiling, daydreaming about how much easier my life would be once I was single again. One thing I knew for sure, once my marriage was over, I would never marry again. Marriage sucked. It was certainly not a way for souls to make their peace with each other. Paul and I would have been better off had we never married. What awful advice I had received when I had gotten that message from within, "He is to be your husband." Husband my ass. As far as I was concerned, our marriage was finished. "It is time for you to get pregnant," came the soundless voice from within. What? Are you crazy? No, I can't have a baby with him. Our marriage is over. I don't love him. He doesn't love me. Absolutely not. Instantly, a feeling of urgency began to gush through me like a river, just as it had years before when I had initially tried to say no in response to that inner message about going to the Eastgate Shopping Center laundromat. I had been so trusting then, but not anymore. No! You must, came the strong current of a feeling within. You must. No! I said, go away. I'm tired of these stupid messages. I want my life back. Leave me alone. The inside feeling of urgency increased. It was akin to Red Alert from the Star Trek series, except without all the breep, 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 or the blinking red lights. No, I said. I'm not falling for that trick. Leave me alone. On and on and on, the red alert feeling of urgency persisted, and with each passing minute, its intensity grew. Please, I prayed to the larger mind, help me. I beg of you, please turn this thing off. It's not fair. I can't have a baby with this man. I gave it my best shot, but I don't love him. I can't love him. And he doesn't love me. Please, please turn this thing off. The feeling of urgency continued to grow and to grow. You must. Where was the larger mind's mercy? Why wasn't I being helped? This alarm was going to make my brain explode. Please, I prayed. Please, I beg of you, please, make this stop. I can't do this. You must, grew the feeling of alarm from within. Curled tight in a ball, face down upon the bed, my head buried beneath two pillows, I knew I couldn't last much longer. I had to put a stop to the incessant, internal, ever-strengthening alarm. So I did the only thing I could think to do. Okay, I yelled. God damn it, you win. I'll do what you want. But there's no way in hell Paul is ever going to agree to this. Instantly, the raging internal alarm turned itself off. Most people don't believe me when I say I had an arranged marriage. Most people also don't believe me when I say, remember, I could be insane. But after 3 years of a not-so-happy marriage, nothing could have been more insane than my approaching Paul to announce it's time for me to get pregnant. How could I request such a thing of a man who had just a few days before expressed anger instead of concern after I had slipped and fallen out of the bathtub? Why did you have to grab the towel rack? He had yelled. Didn't you know that would pull it off the wall? Where the silver chrome towel rack had once been attached to the wall beside the bathtub, a large flap of drywall now pointed towards the floor. I was falling, goddammit, I said. I had to grab onto something. Well, you don't have to curse about it. I'll curse all I want. Damn, you asshole. What baby would want to be born into such an environment? Although the inner alarm had turned itself off after I made the decision to talk to Paul, I had a strong feeling it might turn itself back on again if I decided to ditch the whole idea. But how to put such a request, most especially to a husband who was now more than ever my enemy? Even finding the time to talk to him would be difficult. During the week, we were like two passing ships. By the time Paul was finishing up on campus, I was usually on my way to work. Somehow it didn't feel right to broach this crazy topic late at night after I was home from work. This was the sort of thing, I decided, that should be discussed during the light of day. So I waited until the following Saturday morning. Paul, I said, as he munched his way through a bowl of shredded wheat cereal, his eyebrows almost touching in concentration, which meant that he was thinking about a math problem. I have something to say, and it's probably going to sound crazy. He looked up, releasing the grip of his eyebrows. This might be hard for you to understand, but recently I received a strong, I guess you might call it intuitive message from within that it's time for me to have a baby. No, he said, and his eyebrows came back together as he snatched his cereal bowl from the table to take it to the sink of our small closet-sized kitchen. But Paul, I said, following him into the kitchen, the reason I got married to you in the first place was because of this same kind of an inner message. I was told by this soundless inner voice that you were to be my husband. At the time, I didn't think that was a good idea because we didn't have anything in common. We still don't have anything in common. But I married you because I thought that it was, I guess you might say, God's will, or at the very least, the will of our souls that we get married. Paul was unimpressed. I'm not having a baby, he said. Then heading down the hallway towards the bedroom, he added, I'm not talking about this anymore. Well, that's that. I've done my job, I telepathically beamed to the larger mind, greatly relieved over Paul's reaction. And then came an image in my mind's eye, a large finger hovering over a big red button. I was sure it was a symbol for the control to that damn internal alarm. Okay, I transmitted. I'll try again tomorrow. And since I assumed the larger mind was all around me, I gave it the finger, raising an arm and pointing a middle finger up towards the ceiling. But Paul was just as adamant the next day. Will you please quit pestering me with this stupid baby business? He said. I don't want a baby. Besides, I thought we had agreed we wouldn't have children. You said yourself you didn't want children. What's wrong with you? I already told you, I said. I received another strong inner message. It's not that I want a baby. Maybe there's a soul who wants to be born through me. Maybe this soul and I had an agreement with each other long before I was born. This is crazy, he said. No, I'm not having a baby. Again, the image of the large finger over the big red button flashed through my mind's eye. Geez, I silently transmitted. I'll try again next weekend. I wasn't worried. I had complete confidence that Paul would continue to stand his ground, no matter how many times I asked. In order to satisfy the larger mind, my soul, my subconscious mind, or whatever the hell it was that had set off that damn inner alarm, I would continue with my weekly requests. But it's not as if I could force Paul to impregnate me, and I was pretty sure he would never agree to it. Oh, yeah? Came a strong feeling message from within, and then a seedy little idea slipped its way into my mind. The idea repulsed me. I could never do that. But there again was the image in my mind's eye of that large finger hovering over the big red button. Crap! This isn't fair, I mentally responded. The following weekend, after Paul angrily told me yet again to stop talking about this crazy baby business, I said, okay, you're right. I shouldn't force you. And now for the bombshell of an idea that had come to my mind the previous weekend. If it's truly time for me to get pregnant, I said, that is, if a higher power is now attempting to push me into having a baby, I suppose I can go to the Chapel Hill sperm bank and get pregnant that way. I could not believe what I had just said. I didn't even want a baby, and now here I was like a goddamned fucking fool, talking about going to a sperm bank. I tried to quickly transmit to the larger mind an image of my own finger, the middle finger of my right hand pointing straight up. "You have got to be kidding," said Paul. "I only wish I were," I said, cringing on the inside as I considered just how awful it would be to go to the Chapel Hill sperm bank. "A woman I used to work with used the sperm bank a few years ago," I said, "to become pregnant. If you don't want to impregnate me, but this invisible guiding force continues to tell me that it's time to get pregnant, I'll have to go to the sperm bank." "But you can't do that." "Actually," I said, "I can. It's my body, and I don't want to have regrets on my deathbed. I know it sounds crazy, but if I promised a soul that it could come through me in this lifetime, then it's something that I feel I have to do. Believe me, I wouldn't be pushing this issue if I didn't think that some higher power, call it my soul, call it God, was asking me to do this. I, myself, don't want a baby, but I seem to be a slave to this inner guidance system, whatever it is. It led me to you at the Eastgate Shopping Center laundromat. It told me you were to be my husband. I don't seem to be able to walk away from this inner guidance system. It's like certain aspects of my life were mapped out ahead of time, and when it comes to particular key issues, I don't seem to have the power to steer away from my predetermined path." I said nothing about the horrible inner alarm system that had forced me to speak to him about having a baby. I also dared not mention the time this invisible guiding force had taken control of my mouth, not once but twice in the beginning of our relationship. More and more, I was beginning to worry that I might actually be a schizophrenic. Maybe there was no higher power guiding me at all. Maybe I was being guided by nothing more than a malfunctioning mind. I knew I didn't want a baby. I also knew that I would rather be dead than go to the Chapel Hill sperm bank. But I also knew that I couldn't bear the return of that damn inner alarm system. It had made my head feel as if it were about to explode. "God," I silently prayed, reverting to the language of my childhood self, "please, please help me." "You're my wife," Paul spat angrily. "You can't be impregnated by some other man. That would be wrong." "Yes," I said, "it would be wrong. Unless it's truly for the highest good that I get pregnant. And if that's the case, and you're not willing to impregnate me, then it probably wouldn't be wrong for me to go to the Chapel Hill sperm bank." "But how could it possibly be God's will?" Paul said. "I don't want a baby. If it were God's will, don't you think I would want to get you pregnant?" He had made an excellent point. Probably I really was crazy. But I knew that even if I were crazy, if that inner alarm system were to go off again, I would go to the damn Chapel Hill sperm bank if that's what it took to turn it off. "Look," I said, "all I know is that I had yet another one of those really, really strong inner messages, and when they come, I can't ignore them. It begins to feel as if something bad is going to happen if I do try to ignore them." "So what you're telling me," said Paul, "is that if I don't impregnate you, you're going to go to the Chapel Hill sperm bank?" If this invisible guiding force in my life is demanding that I get pregnant and that it has to happen now, then yes, I guess I will go to the Chapel Hill sperm bank. "This is crazy," he said. You can't do this. Actually, Paul, I can. You don't know what it's like to try and fight against whatever seems to be guiding me in my life. It's quite insistent. I could tell by the look on Paul's face that he knew I was serious, but what he didn't know was that on the inside I was still silently praying. If he says no, I'm off the hook, right? I don't want to be forced to go to the Chapel Hill sperm bank. Please don't make me do that. If there's a soul that's waiting to be born through me, surely it can be born through someone else. Please, please, please don't make me go to the Chapel Hill sperm bank. Please, please don't make me do that. I need some time to think, Paul said. Don't do anything, okay? Just give me some time to think. It took 2 weeks. Much to my surprise, Paul made the decision to impregnate me, and all I could think was, holy fuck. It's a good thing that Paul and I were experienced in the art of brainless, mechanical sex. Before each of our mechanical impregnation sessions, he would always remind me, "This isn't fair. You're forcing me to become a father before I'm ready." Each time I would think, yeah, join the club, buddy. You're not the only one being forced into something you don't want. It seemed that I got pregnant immediately. And then, like a running soundtrack, every day I would hear comments from Paul that ranged anywhere from, "This baby was your idea. I'm too young to be a father," to, "I won't ever feed it. I won't ever change its diapers. You'll have to do everything." That was the background hum of commentary I heard during the first 2 trimesters of my pregnancy. One day, while I was working my shift at WDNC, the station's engineer was in the studio fixing some sort of electronic gadget in the panel of monitors for the station's transmitters. "So I hear you're pregnant," he said. "Yep. I bet your husband is proud." "Nope. He says he's too young to be a father and that I need to remember that once the baby is born, I'll have to be the one to do all the work because he isn't going to change a diaper or ever feed the baby." "Sounds like your husband needs some counseling." "Maybe so," I said. But what I didn't tell the station engineer was that I had by that time received yet another message from the soundless voice within. He will be fine once the baby is born. Some might have assumed I was miserable, having been forced into a pregnancy with a man I didn't love, but to my utter shock, from the moment that I learned I was pregnant, I fell in love with the new speck of life within me. And when, after 4 months, my belly began to protrude ever so slightly, I felt as if I were the happiest woman on the planet. Who knew that a pregnancy could be such a wonderful experience for a woman who had not wanted to be pregnant and who had not wanted to be impregnated by a man she did not love? Had my body's hormones cast some kind of a pregnancy charm over my brain? Perhaps. As Paul continued to pout and complain, I continued to float in a haze of what I assumed was hormonally induced bliss. Though Paul had much to complain about on the home front, by this time he had much to celebrate concerning his career. Before completing his PhD in May of that year, he received a tenure-track offer to teach at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. Since we had decided at the beginning of our marriage that whoever made the most money would determine where we lived, I knew that the course of our lives, at least for the immediate future, was set. Then came the call from Paul's advisor, Joe Sema. "We have to talk," he said. "It's about Paul." "Is something wrong?" "Only that he'll be making the biggest mistake of his life if he goes to William and Mary." Because I was curious to know what in the hell was wrong with a tenure-track position at one of Virginia's most prestigious colleges, I agreed to meet. We arranged a time to have lunch on a day when Paul would be teaching one of his lower-level calculus classes. As I sat across a small table from Dr. Sema, as Paul always referred to him, I realized that I had always liked this man. He was passionate about his math, but he was also passionate about Montana. He spent weeks during the summer in the wilds of Montana each year, camping and hiking, most of the time completely alone. And because I was interested in wilderness areas, he would sometimes tell me stories of his adventures. I was sure, though, that there would be no Montana stories during lunch that day. "You have to convince Paul not to take that job," he said, jabbing at a salad on his plate. "He's too talented. He needs to accept the postdoc from Michigan State he was offered, but I haven't been able to convince him." Pointing his fork towards me, he said, "I was hoping you might be able to convince him. If he goes to a school like William and Mary, where he won't have any time for research, his talent will dry up." He placed his fork down and brought his hands together, elbows on the table, interlaced fingers now above his mostly empty salad plate. "I don't want to see that happen. I've only had a few students like Paul. He's more special than he realizes." And also more special than I had ever realized. Poor Dr. Sema. He thought Paul and I had a normal marriage, a happy one even. How shocked he would have been to know that there was no way in hell I would ever be able to convince Paul not to take the William and Mary job. His family lived in Virginia. He wanted to return to his home state, where he planned to follow in the footsteps of his grandfather and uncles and grow you-pick-em strawberries during the spring and summer. The only thing I was concerned about, other than the upcoming birth of our child, was my chance for future employment opportunities. Williamsburg would surely have plenty of employment opportunities for me, even if they weren't radio jobs, so it was fine with me if Paul accepted the position at William and Mary. On the other hand, I genuinely liked Joe Sema, and I was deeply touched by what he was trying to do for Paul. He was, I could tell, being a true mentor to Paul, and I respected that. No professor had ever cared that much about me. "I'll see what I can do," I told him. When I spoke to Paul late that evening, I was too tired from my shift and the late-night drive home from Durham to have given much thought to what I would say. Convinced that nothing I could say would ever change his mind, I just spit out the first words that came to me. "Paul," I said, after we were both in bed and the lights were turned off, "Joe Sema tells me you're chickening out and taking an easy job at William and Mary because you don't think you're smart enough to handle a research position at MSU." "That's not the reason," he said. "Well, I think that's the reason. You're afraid you won't be good enough, so you're backing away from a challenge. But for the rest of your life, you'll have regrets. If you're going to fail, then fail. But if you're capable of succeeding, then go for it. Take the job at MSU. See if you can run with the big dogs. Otherwise, you're always going to feel like a puny puppy." Satisfied that I had done my best to keep my promise to Joe Sema, I turned away from Paul onto my side so I could try to fall asleep. "All right," came the growl of Paul's voice in the dark. "I'll take the job at MSU." Then, with an increased tone of irritation, he asked, "Are you willing to move up to East Lansing with me?" I turned back over, hardly believing what I had just heard. Quickly, I tallied in my brain the size of Lansing, Michigan, in comparison to Williamsburg. The greater the size of the city, the greater my opportunities for employment would be, I quickly concluded. "Sure," I said. And then I realized in a flash that my heart was thrilled at the thought of moving to completely new territory, a part of the country I had never even seen before. As Paul snored beside me in bed that night, I felt intuitively that this move was going to be good for us. I lay awake for a long time that night, pleased with and excited by the scent of new change in our lives. It was a scent that carried me through the rest of the week, until that Friday afternoon when I got yet another phone call from Craig Curtis at WUNC. "Shelley," he said, "we've got that job for you, assistant music programmer. We want to give you the midday shift. What do you say?" Crap! That's what I wanted to say. My perfect dream job. Why couldn't it have come to me sooner? "Craig, I am so sorry," is what I actually said. "Paul just accepted a job up in Michigan. We're set to move in 3 months." My old friend from my favorite radio station sighed. "Well, we usually ask that folks give us a minimum of 12 months. I might have given you the job if you could have guaranteed us 6 months, but 3 months is too short a period. I'm sorry." "Me too," I said. Tears were in my eyes as I hung up the phone, but to my surprise, I didn't begin to cry. I was sad, but not as sad as I would have expected myself to be. Why was that? As I sat there analyzing my feelings, I realized that deep down inside, it felt as if my heart had flown the coop and was already waiting for me up in Michigan.